ask that any of you have additional updates to send them to Esperanza, and we'll email this out. We switched the update from NECANN from before lunch to now, and I'll introduce that in just a moment. And then shorten the afternoon segment so there'll be plenty of time for discussion and we can get everyone out on time. So Esperanza would normally be here to present the NECANN update and the website. She unfortunately has a flu. She regrets that she can't be here. And Beth from NOAA has agreed to do the presentation in her absence.
Yeah, so you'll be happy to hear that I have no slides. And I'm just going to give you a little oral update and a little tour of the website. So I do work for NOAA, but today I am speaking on behalf of NECANN, the Northeast Coastal Acidification Network. As we already discussed this morning, the real issue is the coastal acidification part, not so much the ocean acidification part. And so NECANN is one of a large number now of coastal acidification networks that are springing up around the nation. And most of them are actually building on the NECANN example. So once again, you know, we find that there we go, we are leading, right? We're very happy about that. I have two other members of the steering committee in the audience, Joe Salisbury and Bill Mook are both on the steering committee and both chair or co-chair one of the working groups. So NECANN has been in existence for 3 or 4 years. And it actually was a very grassroots thing. Rue Morrison, who works for the Northeast Coastal Ocean Observing System, sort of thought it would be a good idea to have a coastal acidification network to help bring together some of the information around coastal acidification and to be a sort of nexus of action regionally here. So again, it's a grassroots thing, it's a volunteer thing, you know, we don't have any paid staff except for the people who work for NERACOOS. And we are trying to compile information and make that information available to people who can use it. So we spent a lot of time in our initial years doing stakeholder outreach meetings, and maybe some of you have come to some of them, where we tried to gauge what the information needs were and what people were most concerned about. We've taken that information and now we're kind of going into our next step. We're building an implementation plan that is going to try to help address some of those concerns. And I hope you've all seen our video. I won't show it now, but please look at it. Maine Sea Grant was quite instrumental in helping us put that together. It's very entertaining, and it's a very short little cartoon, but I never tire of watching it. So we do have a new website. You can see that the landing site is no longer through NERACOOS. We have our own little address, so it's just very simple, necann.org. And we have some general information on coastal acidification, some of its effects, some of the research priorities that were identified at those stakeholder meetings, some of the conditions that you've already seen some slides of this earlier in the day. Some ideas about what to do. We also are building a reference library that comes out with all of the new publications that we can get our hands on. And what we try to do with this is not just have a reference list, but also to do a real annotated bibliography. So there's a 2 or 3 sentence description of what's in the paper for people who may not want to read 25 pages of scientific text. And we also have a list of the types of resources that we are providing. We had a series of webinars early in our existence where we tried to get the state of the science. So we had science presentations from a lot of regional experts about various aspects of ocean and coastal acidification. These are recorded, and you can go to YouTube through this link and look at any of them you want to. We had just restarted that seminar series. Aaron was our first to kick off the new iteration of the seminar series. We're having another one the early next month that Scott Doney is going to give based on the project that he shares with Sarah Cooley. So that's very exciting, and you'll be able to get those recordings. I think Aaron's is already up, and I think you'll be able to get those as well. And you can also see the reports from the stakeholder workshops down here, so that you can see state by state what those concerns are. So that's just sort of the update from NECAN. As I said, we are working on an implementation plan. One of the things that we're focused on in the coming year is developing some guidance for monitoring for coastal acidification. We're working with EPA on developing methods for monitoring and some guidance document. And so we want to, once that document is confirmed, we want to be able to have perhaps a webinar that talks about how this can be applied in various locations. And we're going to continue to build out the reference library, especially this sort of annotated bibliography idea. And we're going to consider how best to support our working groups. We do have 4 working groups. I co-chair the policy working group. Joe is a co-chair of the science working group. Bill is chairing the industry working group. And Esperanza is chair of the education and outreach working group. So we're constantly looking for people who are interested to become involved in those. So if you have any interest in that, you can find the way to sign up on the website, or you can just email me. I'm elizabeth.turner@noaa.gov. And I think that's as far as I want to go, unless there are questions.
This afternoon's session is on policy that we can use primarily to address coastal acidification. The first presenter is Representative Mick Devon, who just been re-elected for his 3rd term for District 90, and has been a champion of ocean and coastal acidification. I'm sorry.
No, I don't think it's So thank you very much, Ivy. With the election results that we just experienced a week or so ago, I'm sure that a few of you are very concerned, not only at the state level, but particularly at the federal level, what will happen in terms of environmental organizations and environmental priorities, specifically those that are for us who are working on the Coast of Maine marine policies. And I want to mention a few things. First of all, when the initial ocean acidification bill was passed to establish the council, which Senator Johnson and myself co-chaired, that passed with not much of a difference of the legislative makeup that we have now. Governor LePage was in office. We did the Senate Democrats controlled the Senate, but only by a slim margin, and in the House, Democrats controlled the House, but a relatively small margin. Last time around, with the Senate being controlled by the Republicans, we were able to get through a marine debris bill. So I certainly have not given up on the possibility of moving forward on policy for coastal acidification. And the one thing I want to point out today is that we have no less than 3 departments represented here. So we have the DEP, we have the DMR, and we have Agriculture Conservation Enforcement. So not only are we a diverse group, but we have support from the executive branch here with us today. And I think that is a very important and noteworthy fact as we move forward. And with that, we don't know at this stage if any legislation will be moved forward in this coming term. We don't know obviously what that will be. And this afternoon is the start of that conversation. And that will go on. Cloture is going to be in mid-December. For those of you who aren't aware of what cloture is, cloture is the deadline to submit bills. So we have approximately a month to make a determination of whether it makes sense now to put forth any bills related to ocean and coastal acidification. By no means are we going to make any decisions today. In fact, I will be leaving here at 2 o'clock to hop on a plane to represent the legislature in California in the Veterans Issues Conference. So I don't even be here for the full discussion. The other thing I want to mention is that Representative Lydia Bloom told me at lunch today that the first Coastal Caucus will occur on January 17th. January 17th. That will start off with a talk about marine policy and priorities in general for the upcoming session. And then there will be a technical aspect to that, and she will invite in to talk about coastal and ocean acidification. And this will be an opportunity for those of us that know a little bit about coastal and ocean acidification to educate legislators. Because the only way we're ever going to be able to get policy moved forward is to educate those folks that are in office. With that, have I done everything I need to say?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you. Any questions today? No questions, good.
The next presenter is Assistant Professor Aaron Strong. And Aaron started teaching at the University of Maine this fall, but it seems like he's been here a lot longer. Ever since Aaron knew that he was going to return to Maine, he's a Maine native who's been working on marine policy at a national level. He has engaged with MUCA, and we are so happy to have him as part of it.
Well, thanks so much, Ivy. I really appreciate that. And also thanks to Representative Devon for hosting us here in the Legislative Council in Augusta. And it's great to kick off a conversation about what some of the future legislative and policy priorities might be. This morning, we heard about a lot of the intricacies of the role of nutrients, some of the potential for phytoremediation and the questions. And obviously, there's a ton more science to do. There always is. And we need to do that science. And that might be one of the things that we talk about this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, which is the potential for future regulatory approaches, essentially using the Clean Water Act and its role in setting water quality standards to address ocean acidification. This is a national conversation that's going on right now involving states on the West Coast, and most notably, of course, involving the EPA at the federal level. And I want to frame that in the context of how we might think about initiating some discussions in Maine on this issue. If you saw my webinar, it was largely focused on pretty much the same topic. And so for those of you who did see that webinar, I welcome your questions. And in particular, this won't be a 60-minute version, it's like a 12-minute version, in order for us to have time to actually engage in some discussions about whether this is something we might want to think about in Maine and what it would look like. What are the next steps? What are the conversations that we need to start having? That's the goal of this afternoon. So a quick outline. First, I'm going to talk briefly about water quality standards and what they are to kind of bring everyone up to the same speed, and then talk about some potential approaches to using water quality standards to address ocean and coastal acidification. I can't get out of the habit of writing OA and writing OCA. I haven't been able to do it yet. Maybe I should just write CA, but that's not as like clearly coastal acidification, but clearly we're talking about coastal acidification here. So the Clean Water Act's goal is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And yes, that does include its marine waters. And it's a really dynamic interplay between the EPA and the states that goes on here. And so there's a role for both the EPA and for state water quality authorities. So the EPA sets general guidance on water quality standards for the state to follow, the states to potentially follow. And we'll talk about that as it relates to pH. States then set their own water quality standards, and within each state there are designated uses and specific criteria for different water body segments. So what is the water body to be used for? Recreation, fishing, or other designated uses. And then what are the criteria for different grades of water quality in those water bodies? And then they assess all of those different water bodies, all those different segments, to see whether they're meeting those criteria in order that are sufficient for the designated uses. And if they're not, then those water bodies can be found to be impaired. States develop a list of impaired water bodies under Section 303D, which is called the 303D list, which are then sent and approved by the EPA. So the EPA has an ability to approve the impairment designations as well as the state-specific criteria. If water bodies become impaired according to specific criteria, states develop total maximum daily loads and other plans to address the causes of impairment, both from point sources and non-point sources, through stricter permitting requirements for point sources and through the development of best management practices for non-point source pollution. We heard about non-point source pollution this morning. At our previous meeting, we discussed point sources, and Ivy will talk a little bit about point sources this afternoon. Water quality criteria broadly fall into two different kind of types. One are narrative criteria. These are often linked to biological uses. So a narrative criteria would be that a water body needs to be sufficient to maintain biological integrity and the propagation of shellfish, for example. So that if you can't propagate shellfish in this water body, it is impaired. It's narrative in the sense that it is not explicitly numeric, right? There are also numeric criteria, often a specific threshold or value. But if there's one measurement below a certain level of dissolved oxygen, then that water body is impaired for oxygen, for example. And states have a variety of sets of both narrative and numeric criteria for a whole lot of different pollutants. So when we think about acidification, the first pollutant most people think about, of course, is pH. And pH is a recognized pollutant under the Clean Water Act. And in Section 304 of the Clean Water Act, which we have national water quality standards from the EPA, a national water quality standard for marine water's pH has been developed and was first developed in 1976, and then again renewed in 1986. And that standard is as follows: that marine water should be between 6.5 and 8.5 pH, and that marine water's pH should not change more than 0.2 pH units from normal. Now, what is normal is a major, major, major challenge here. We saw Damien's graph of estuaries. We understand what photosynthesis and respiration do to DIC levels. We understand somewhat what the mechanistic drivers are for changes in our estuaries, and we know that the variability is really, really high. So the effect has been that the standard for use in ocean acidification hasn't been used, isn't being used, because we don't know what baseline is and what normal is, right? In order to make a determination that a specific stressor, a specific pollutant, whether it's global CO2 or the local drivers of coastal acidification, has made a change greater than 0.2 pH units. And the states in New England have largely adopted similar versions of these in their own water quality standards. Remember I said EPA sets these general standards and then the states develop specific criteria. So we see a whole bunch of 6.5 to 8.5 pH units, and some versions have changed from normal. Sometimes it's 0.5, sometimes it's 0.2, but we have this conundrum. We know that acidification is a water quality problem for our nation's coastal waters because it has the current potential to affect aquaculture industry, has the current potential to affect shellfish, has the strong future potential to affect shellfish. It's clearly a water quality problem in our nation's waters, which fall under the Clean Water Act. We know that acidification is caused by a suite of drivers, of course, anthropogenic CO2, but also all these drivers of coastal acidification, right? Nutrient loading, changing the DIC in particular locations when you have photosynthesis and respiration being decoupled. Low alkalinity freshwater coming through our rivers into our coast. We saw the graph that Damien put up from Joe Salisbury's work in the Kennebec, right? So we know that there are these local drivers that are affecting the conditions that are affecting our natural resources. And we know that pH is considered a pollutant and that the loss of uses of these waters is generally an impairment, right? They're being impaired, but we aren't using the Clean Water Act right now to go after acidification, right? We aren't using the Clean Water Act to manage acidification within the current marine pH criteria that we have. So the question becomes, can Clean Water Act implementation be modified to include acidification, and should it? That's not an easy question. It seems like it logically flows from this, but actually doing it with the state of the science that we have and the monitoring equipment we have is really hard. So I'm going to talk through some of the options for doing this. right? Some of the potential approaches for developing criteria that are specific to ocean acidity. And it's important to frame this in a context, which is that the EPA is being sued and has been repeatedly sued. I've talked to Matt Liebman about this a great deal, but it's been a history that's going on for the last almost 10 years, I think, since the Center for Biological Diversity first sued EPA for approving Washington State's 303D list. Basically, the Center for Biological Diversity said, hey, we're seeing impairment of water quality for ocean acidification in Puget Sound. And Washington State is not listing Puget Sound as impaired for marine waters pH. And then the EPA is approving that list. There's a problem here. We're going to sue. And Washington State said, look, we're complying with the law. We don't know what this deviation from the normal state is, and none of the data you've given us about global pH change, citing the papers that look at global pH change, actually demonstrate that there are particular stressors that are causing this pH change. And furthermore, for our narrative criteria, we can't know that all of the effect on oyster growth, for example, and shellfish propagation is due particularly to these issues. We need more data. And the EPA said, we're going to approve this and we're going to let it go through. And that's what the status quo was for a while. Eventually in 2010, after another round of lawsuits, after another round of these 303D impairment listings, EPA said, look, we recognize this is an issue. We recognize that we need to develop new standards, and we recognize that 303D and impairment designation should apply to ocean acidification. But we need to figure out what those standards are going to be. And that was in 2010. So the EPA said, yes, this is an appropriate law. Yes, this applies to ocean acidification, but we don't know how to approach it yet. We need more data. We need more information. And then this last summer, CBD, the Center for Biological Diversity based on the West Coast, sued again. And this is finally, their claims are really twofold. One, that the current criteria should mean that we're listing it as impaired, but they're not going to win that battle in court. There's too much deference to the agency, and rightfully so. They're following the letter of what they have. They don't have the information that they need to do this. Then EPA should also update its national standards to reflect the latest science. And that's where our kind of role in thinking about this creatively. I don't have an agenda here. I don't have a particular thing saying, we need to use the Clean Water Act right now, that this should be done. One of the answers is clearly we don't have any ability to do this right now, and as good as it sounds, we can't do it. And this is not just me, this is in the popular press, and this is The Atlantic. The Atlantic is talking about EPA's role in ocean acidification. The little subtext here is, in part, it's because no one knows how to best do it. But my thinking is this. We're here in Maine Ocean and Coastal Acidification Partnership, one of the few states that's had a commission process, one of the few states with a robust network of scientists and agency folks interested in addressing this problem and with clear impacts on the livelihoods of our coastal communities, right? So can we be part of the conversation about how best to do it if we should do it? And that's where we stand today. Actually, this is where we stand today. So for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to talk through 4 approaches that have been put out into the literature, 4 ideas of what we could do. I'm going to give you some advantages for each one and some challenges for each one. And that's my intention here, is to just plant the seed of those ideas. We have this statute. We don't have a lot of environmental statutes. We're not going to get any big new ones at the federal level, likely anytime soon. But we can use these statutes. We're using the Clean Air Act, at least so far, to go after greenhouse gases, right? To try to regulate greenhouse gases and sources of greenhouse gases, right? Can we use the Clean Water Act to go after ocean acidification? What would that be? So one approach is to use the biological narrative criteria. Many states currently have some version of the propagation of shellfish as a designated use or other general narrative criteria associated with shellfish impacts. So the advantage is that nothing really new is required if we get guidance saying, we should do this through narrative criteria. Most states have such a criterion, and it's usually associated with population effects of a particular contaminant. But it's not that simple, as we've seen from Washington State, which had narrative criteria. It's not that simple. Many states have very different versions of what can trigger such criteria and how to assess biological indicators, but maybe we can get past that. But here's where the rubber hits the road. You have to show population impacts, and you have to show it's linked to an OA-related stressor in order to really demonstrate that this pollutant, whatever the OA-related stressor is is causing the impairment, and we can try to ameliorate that impairment. And so this means we need coupled biogeochemical and biological monitoring. We need to be able to say that the shellfish are suffering here because of aragonite saturation state, and that aragonite saturation state is linked in particular to the following drivers and stressors. In other words, we need to answer all the questions that Damien set us up with in the morning. That's what we need. That's why we're putting in proposals to try to do that. Because it's not just key for the state of the science, it's key for using approaches like this. There's one other caveat I want to throw out here. Some people are not just concerned about shellfish. Obviously, in Maine, our primary concern is about commercially important species. That's why it was written into the commission, right? But there are other ecological effects of ocean acidification which would not be included in a pure shellfish propagation biological narrative criteria approach. So approach 2, we have pH criteria, but we need to move beyond this plus or minus 0.2 unit. And this is what CBD proposed originally in their first lawsuit. For marine waters pH, it should not deviate measurably from naturally occurring pH levels as a result of absorption of anthropogenic CO2 pollution. Advantages, pH is already a recognized pollutant under the Clean Water Act. Challenge, we haven't solved the natural range problem here of having baseline data. Estuaries have incredibly highly variable pH that needs to be accounted for in that baseline data. And even if we recognize sources of pH variability other than CO2, so the original goal here for these lawsuits was to try to use the Clean Water Act to get comprehensive carbon policy at the national level, because if CO2 is what's doing the impairment, then you'd have to go after CO2 in each one of these states. EPA has basically said that's not going to happen. You're not going to go after CO2 due to this. But setting that aside, even if we recognize sources of pH variability other than CO2, we don't have the science to build an OA budget yet. Again, we need to answer the questions that Damien set us up with in the morning. So alternative 3 are different numeric criteria, not pH. Setting aside the debate that Bill Mook talked about whether aragonite saturation state and omega is the right criteria or not, maybe we need to move beyond pH and use other carbonate chemistry parameters, PCO2, total alkalinity, and coupled with omega as a basis for numeric criteria. The advantage of this is Nicole this morning put a red line on her graph, right? We've seen lots of graphs where there's a red line for aragonite saturation state. Here's where you see the effects. That's naturally linked into this idea of that's a threshold, right? That's a threshold that we can operationalize if we have the data to assess it. So there's a clear advantage in the sort of intuitive advantage of linking this measurement as opposed to pH, which has more direct links to the impairments that we're concerned about. But sources of variability, of course, aren't strictly anthropogenic. We said nutrients this morning a lot, right? But some of those nutrients are coming from stormwater. Some of those nutrients are actually coming from the Gulf of Maine in this deep pool of nitrate. Some of those are anthropogenic, and you can pull the lever of the Clean Water Act on them. We already do, right? But some of those are not strictly anthropogenic in that sense. So how do you deal with that variability if you use a criterion approach like this? Okay, approach 4. Something different, something new, something OA specific, right? Not the biological criteria, not pH, not aragonite saturation state. We need to develop ecological narrative criteria that are specific to the circumstance of acidification, rather than simply an amalgamation of our already existing criteria. The advantage is clear. It allows a tailoring to the problem. But the challenges are it's new and therefore challenging. What would it actually look like? And it would require states to develop this piece by piece. So what becomes key here are monitoring data. As you can see, in each one of these potential approaches, we need baseline data on natural variability of pH, omega, carbonate chemistry, and biological communities, all up and down the coast, in the near shore in particular. We need targeted studies and peer-reviewed literature on individual water bodies. And that would go a long way to including those to inducing impairment determinations. We need more data in state waters. We need to gauge our rivers. Basically, this is another way of saying, yeah, we need all these data, but we need all these data if we want to explore any of these regulatory options. And most importantly, we need to link our biological and biogeochemical data. And what's next? Well, let's keep talking. With our plans currently through NECAN and the Policy Working Group, to actually host a workshop in the spring sometime to discuss these options and bring everyone together to talk about what it might look like. This just happened on the West Coast, and we can do it in the Northeast region. And finally, I want to set up Ivy to talk next I've talked to you about OA criteria, OA specific criteria. We don't have those yet. We have this marine pH criteria, but we're not using it. So if we want to use it, there's some options I just put on the table. Those are options that are being discussed in the literature and on the West Coast. I want to open the discussion here. But we do have a lot of concern about nutrients in the state and their relation to coastal acidification. What I've talked to you about is not nutrient specific, and Ivy's going to tell some of the nutrients out of this starting. And then we're going to have a discussion after.
Yes, part of what we're going to do this afternoon, instead of questions right now for Aaron, please write them down or remember them. This is like a unique opportunity for us to get to talk to so many scientists and introduce the policy topics and have a discussion with leading managers, wastewater treatment facilities, stormwater, some of the best scientists in the state who are working on this issue. And so we wanted to do our presentations back to back and then have a discussion. As Aaron said, we don't have any particular agenda. We don't have a particular sort of policy that we are promoting or recommending, but there are so many questions for us to answer. So you've heard about non-point sources and MS4 permits for that, and you've heard about sort of the national level and OA criteria and the CBD lawsuit. We're going to focus at this talk on point sources. So first off, for those of you I haven't met, I'm the Casco Bay keeper with Friends of Casco Bay, and our work is specifically focused on Casco Bay, and we have about 25 years of data relating to the Bay. So it first started as a volunteer organization with Joe Payne as the original Bay keeper, and today we have a staff of 10 and 2 boats on the Bay. So we have 2 research scientists, and I try to go out with them as much as possible. And we have a pump out boat that over the summer pumps out waste on boats so that it doesn't get discharged into the Bay. So we're on the water year round, and we collect data year round. These are the parameters that we test for, and with respect to OA, a lot of these categories is useful. The investigating anomalies includes things like looking at the cause of fish kills or algal blooms. Our staff does most of the monitoring using data sondes. We have 3 profile sites. We used to have 10, now we have 3, one in Broad Sound, one off of Falmouth and Cumberland Foreside, and one by the mouth of the Presumpscot River. So we can get sort of a good read on conditions in the Bay, and we go to those sites once a month. And this year we have our first unattended sonde. It's by the ferry dock on Cousins Island, and it's the first time we're getting data around the clock, and it's working out really well. We're very excited about it. We augment what we do with citizen scientists. They sample at 37 sites around the Bay every other Saturday from April to October, twice a day. And that's the data that we use to create the sort of health index of Casco Bay. And we've also started doing events like a nabbing nitrogen event this summer. We coordinated this in particular. There were local municipalities involved, but we worked closely with Maine Department of Environmental Protection. And the goal of it was to get a snapshot in time of nitrogen loading, because it was just one grab sample, 97 people, all taking a sample at 10:10 a.m. And what was so cool about this sample was after 2 weeks of no rain, it rained, and there was a CSO event right before we did this sample. So we can't wait to get these results. Not that it will be indicative of, it will give us a snapshot of what nutrient loading can look like from one stormwater event. So I'm going through this overview because this is some of the science that is 25 years of data collection that can be applied to policy decisions. And this is just our science, and it combined with the science of lots of other people can be used to help find policy solutions. And as a waterkeeper organization, we use science and the law to advocate for a healthy Casco Bay. So I don't have to talk about this. Others who are much more knowledgeable have already covered coastal acidification. For some reason, the slide, I don't know why the graphic isn't up here, but what this slide would show, if the graphic were here, is that our data shows that when there's more fresh water, there is more nitrogen. So
And the sources of excess nitrogen in the bay, this is an old graphic, but the ratios are pretty accurate. And we've talked about non-point source, we've talked about atmospheric. I'm focusing on this aspect in my presentation. So Clean Water Act, the version that we all know as the Clean Water Act, was passed in 1972, and you can't discharge pollutants into waters of the United States from a point source without a permit. And those permits are known as National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits, or NPDES permits. So it can be, point sources are conveyances like pipes, that's a CSO, whoops, sorry. That's a CSO right there, which is a combined sewer overflow, or from a discharge pipe from a treatment plant, power plants, things like that. So in 2001, EPA, which issues NPDES permits, delegated the authority to issue those permits in Maine to the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. So since that time, the permits here are known as NPDES permits. And EPA continues to oversee that permit program and to maintain enforcement authority. And this is just an example of what a front page of one of those permits looks like. There's a permit, for those of you who haven't seen it, and then a fact sheet attached to the permit that has all the analysis. And that's what's always so interesting to talk to scientists about, because that's where all the explanation is of how the department did its calculations to arrive at what it put in the permit. So in its simplest sense, through a NPDES permit, we can impose monitoring requirements if we need more information. We can set limits on the amount of nitrogen that can be discharged. And I think also is equally important, NPDES permits, the term of the permits is 5 years. So there's an iterative process, or a chance to constantly be looking at the impacts of the terms of that permit. And the basis for NPDES or NPDES permits is to maintain water quality, and if it's degraded, to bring it back up to water quality. So you don't wait until the water body is impaired before imposing stricter limitations, if that's what's needed. So it's a process that, even though this tool's been around for a long time, has a lot of implications for us in how we use them. So then the question becomes, how do we determine in an individual permit if we need to set nitrogen limits? And Aaron set us up nicely with the discussion that we can either have numeric criteria or narrative criteria. So either a number, and if you discharge above that number, you're gonna have to reduce it, or we look at the impacts on the biological setting. So in Maine, there was a resolve in 2007. Yes, this is the pet actually trained to clean up after himself. There was a resolve in 2007 to ask the state to develop a plan for adopting numeric criteria. This is the preamble from that recognizes that nutrient pollution contributes to nuisance algal growth, that it comes from diverse sources. I've only highlighted 2 of those there because I'm only focusing on point sources, not to single them out in any other way. And it's also noted that bays south of us already are suffering significant water quality degradation. Our goal is we don't want to go there. So this resolve was passed and asks the state to do something with numeric criteria. So these were the 4 items that DEP was charged with developing: a conceptual plan, a work plan, a report on technological approaches, and an inventory of significant point and non-point sources of nutrients to the waters of Casco Bay. Casco Bay was singled out because it was identified in the legislation as a priority. It's in the most populous watershed. It faces threats from future development, is already known to have high concentrations of nutrients, and because of data collection from organizations like ours, and including ours, there was already a fairly good set of available nutrient data. So consistent with that resolve, DEP completed a report to the legislature in 2008. And since then, there has not been any further development of numeric criteria. Now, That's pretty true around the country, that there hasn't been development of numeric criteria. This is an interactive map from the EPA website. If you actually were to go to this, you could click on those. Level 5 would be a state that has a complete set of nitrogen and phosphorus criteria. There are none. And there are only a few states that have level 4, which is 2 or more water types with nitrogen or phosphorus criteria. So the fact that we don't have them is consistent with what's happening around the country, and it's something that, you know, we should talk about whether or not it makes sense for us to have numeric criteria. Narrative criteria, the way that's what we're currently using in our MIPDES permits to determine whether there should be nitrogen limits set. And the test is the reasonable potential for the discharge of total nitrogen to cause or contribute to non-attainment of applicable water quality standards in marine waters. And the way that that's being applied is twofold. The Department of Environmental Protection is either looking at 0.32 milligrams per liter of nitrogen, and if it's above that, is there indication that the nitrogen is having a negative impact on eelgrass? And if it's an area, if the discharge is in an area that either doesn't have eelgrass or hasn't historically had beds of eelgrass, then they're looking at 0.45 milligrams per liter of total nitrogen and using dissolved oxygen as the indicator. I'm going through this quickly. There are people here from DEP. There are detailed questions about this. When we have the question and answer, I certainly will refer to them. This just gives you, this is from an overview of our data. It just gives you an idea of the levels of nitrogen that we're seeing in Casco Bay. The data is broken down into 3 subsets. That was done just where there was a natural break in the data. The fact that the green dot is 0.38 and below isn't an indication by us that that's fine or okay or anything like that. It's just how the data is reported. Nicole looked earlier at the fact that the eelgrass cover has changed a lot in Casco Bay. Just the fact that it's missing, though, it doesn't answer the question that the nitrogen was the cause of that, because we know that a lot of the eelgrass loss was also due to predation. So just because it was there and isn't there still doesn't answer whether there needs to be nitrogen limits in the permit. This is just an example from a report of the type of things that are looked for. They're looking for density in the eelgrass beds. Are the edges of the eelgrass meadow retreating? And then, especially in the late summer, are there signs of prevalence of epiphytes and nuisance algae? And those can be indicators that the eelgrass is suffering from too much nitrogen. And then, how far do you look? Like, how far do you look in the eelgrass beds to see if there is an issue? And this is also a fairly new area, and one that Angie talked about back in the June symposium. So for traditional looking at pollutants, traditionally the DEP has used the Cormex model, which has these ranges of dilution. And for nitrogen, right now, DEP is looking at far field dilution, and you can see that that is a much broader field. These are just from 2 permits that I just took out as an example, just so you can see the difference. The calculation of far field dilution is going to be different for each MIPDES permit. And far field dilution, it's a new model. DEP is working on it. It's not a model that we see used elsewhere in the country for looking at nitrogen, and it doesn't analyze the reasonable potential in the near field. It's looking at a much broader scope than that. So both EPA and Friends of Casco Bay have questioned the use of the far field dilution model, and it's something that the department has consulted with an outside expert, and something that would be wonderful to have a discussion about if that's appropriate. So the questions for this group least come out of Aaron's talk and my talk, and maybe these aren't even the right questions, you can certainly change them or let us know, but should we, as the 2007 resolve asks, be developing numeric nutrient criteria? I don't know what the answer to that is, whether one is better than the other, but it's a question we could ask. And consistent with the 2007 resolve, should we continue to treat Casco Bay as a priority? And if we're going to look at setting up a model for one area, should we continue to focus on that area? How should the reasonable potential of nitrogen in the effluent be evaluated? Is it the far field dilution model, or is it a different model? Do we need a model? And then sort of tying back into Aaron's presentation, should we be developing nutrient or other criteria specific to ocean or coastal acidification? So I want to open this up for discussion at this point and questions, and there are so many experts in the room that I hope that we just have a good dialogue about what we do with these, or whether we should form a small subgroup to be working on some or all of these questions.
One really general question. It goes back to historical. When did ocean coastal acidification begin? When did it begin having been? Can we say, have we looked at sediment and said, well, what we looked at sediment only about?
Do you want to take that?
Joe or Larry may have a better idea, but for instance, I would say that before the Clean Water Act in 1971, there's probably a whole lot more organic matter in marine waters than there is today. So from the perspective of respiring organic matter, my guess is it was potentially worse before the Clean Water Act. But I think Aaron put it best. I don't think we have enough data to say this is what happened, and this was the biological effect.
So eelgrasses and other such things were an indicator?
So what eelgrass, so the loss of eelgrass, it's due to light attenuation that can sometimes be nutrients, right? So you get nutrients, it goes phytoplankton, and it shades out eelgrass. A lot of the eelgrass in our case aquarius could also be reed crabs, for instance. So again, it's a little hard to parse out which is the most direct factor.
I'll add to that at the global scale, right? If we think about CO2 as a driver of ocean acidification globally, we know that in each area, there's a lot of variability of pH. But by using proxies for what pH, the pH environment was 100 years ago, 150 years ago, we can actually show that the average pH level was down here, was let's say here, and now it's down here. Even though there's a lot of variability now and there's a lot of variability then, on a hundreds of years time scale, we can certainly see the overall effects of anthropogenic CO2 emissions. The challenge is at some of these more local scales and local time scales and local spatial scales, understanding that baseline is not as easy.
It's also a hard question. You say we're going to start with a simple question, but it's not a simple question because it's hard. Like it's not as if all this data has been collected and suddenly it's like, okay, now we're measuring it. It's something that's been progressing over time since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and the way that we monitor and measure and think about this has been evolving as well. So I don't know that that there's a specific. I can't answer your question.
I can.
Yeah, go ahead. For you, what was it? Yeah, go ahead.
So, I think that ocean acidification became known because of the oyster industry, first on the West Coast, and then a little bit on the East Coast. And it was I think there was a tipping point reached at a hatchery level, which is very different from out in the natural estuary, but it was in the mid part of the last decade. And so probably in the 2005 to 2007 timeframe, the Pacific coast, mostly Washington State and Oregon, experienced an 80% drop in their hatchery wildlife production. It was devastating.
Fundamentally different physical
True, but then for us, which is more of the kind of drivers we saw huge impact on our business that kind of came to a peak in 2009.
Yeah, it's a physical thing because you're seeing it as a result of storms.
That was those are the wettest years.
It was one of the wettest years.
Not one of them.
But I guess here's the point I would make, is that once we understood what was happening, and we started buffering water every time we brought water to raise water, our production became perfect. I mean, it's not like it's not as though it got better, you know, we could live with it. We became perfect. So it obviously the impact was quite a bit before that, but it came to a critical point at that 2009 for us. And it's probably very different in every location. Some places I don't think it hit that.
So ocean acidification, coastal acidification was occurring in the 80s and the 90s.
Well, it's been created for, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Chris?
Do we have a handle based on the volume of manufacture of fertilizers and their use in Maine? How much is sold in Maine? How much of that opportunity for increased nutrient loading? Obviously, we have a handle on what the atmosphere is here too.
So you're asking if we know what the nutrient loading is for
Yes,
fertilizers?
as part of trying to answer in what time frame have things changed significantly as we find influencing factors that we have to measure by the nature-based fertilizers.
Yeah, I think in terms of answering the question, with that tipping point, before answering your question, what are we looking at? Are we looking at coral reefs? Are we looking at the oyster industry? You know, and it's cumulative. Okay, so in Pasco Bay, was Mike left already?
You know, clear models.
Yeah, I mean, we have data that looks at the change in pH and the change in temperature over time, but in terms of answering that specific question, I don't know that we can answer it with precision. In terms of the impact of fertilizers and pulling that out of what percentage is that of stormwater pollution? No, that's something that I think there's the Pasco Bay Estuary Partnership is being a nutrient council, and I think one of the questions that has been discussed is because there isn't a total maximum daily load that pulls out what everything is, but should we have that better type of understanding and then be targeting those type of resources? And I know that what we've done in the meantime is have a basemaking program that encourages people to, you know, not use fertilizers and work with towns on fertilizer and pesticide bans. But maybe from the county, do you have?
Yeah, we have some data at Cumberland County Soil Conservation District. We have a large scaling program, and I can get back to that too. It's to again assess whether we need to apply some kind of commitment. Then if you do, exactly what concentration. So we have some data on sales. And I think the Midland Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission also has some whose they've done work on this in Massachusetts, but they're gathering New England wide. Does it give a whole picture? No, but it helps fill in part of, we look at it from a scientific standpoint and mass out, you know, here's our water body, here are the sources coming in, and here's how those sources are used to help answer part of that.
Yeah.
But to call back to the take home slide I said earlier, it's not just how much nutrients are there, how much of it is moving and flowing, and that is a combination of the concentration of nutrients plus the storm frequency and intensity. So it could be that nutrient loading per se has not changed at all over the time. It's the storm frequency and intensity that could happen.
The delivery.
So we think about all of this, which is so complicated, and we try to contemplate policy. Does anyone have any thoughts? I mean, should we stay with narrative criteria or numeric criteria or jump?
So it seems to me that, well, first of all these certifications that I can pick up, maybe with the exception of atmosphere deposition, we should think in terms of CO2. So we should track the CO2, whether it's from land or remineralization or nutrient stimulation or whatever. But I really think we need this, just like
scientific, but you need this concept of a proton. The proton is what really acts with hydrogen ions. And we have to know where they are coming from: land, air, ocean, sediment. And, you know, we desperately need a better, and they have to be regionalized or localized too. Casco Bay is going to, you know, behave differently than Pleasant River estuary that has a whole bunch of different sources, much more acidic than Casco Bay, but it's driven by a different set of processes.
What would that look like? Given what we just said about criteria, I agree with you. We need a proton budget.
Sell that one.
I guess I think that's some of the things that whatever is developed has to be done sort of on a more localized basis, region by region. And then it's hard because where does the guidance come from? I mean, there really aren't any other states that use as a model. And we can see that at the national level, there's a lot of uncertainty as well.
What did this mean?
Let me tell everyone, this is like, let's find a database versus law. I'm not sure quite how to word it, but maybe. Sorry, Ron.
Yes, well, one thing I noticed, we did a study with Mousetrap about superphosphate fertilizers. Most of them, the phosphates come from particular binding areas, and they have a certain amount of radium in them from Florida ones as Florida headphones. And I'm wondering if some kind of trace of that might be something you can pick up in the fertilizer.
To determine what percentage is fertilizer.
There are better isotopes.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
We need the nutrient budget, and we need the change in proton availability budget from oceanic sources, terrestrial sources, atmospheric sources as well. There's two different kinds of full budgets.
Oh, no, it would really be the same. It's trying to track the protons, but the nitrogen stimulates the productivity and then the remineralization. So
I have a couple ill-formed comments. The first is that Joe helped me do something that for me was really useful when we looked at the data we were collecting on Azure. It was basically looking at what the current, we were using Omega, looking at what the current Omega was. Everybody's sort of seen that. I've seen the talks I gave. I think I showed this graph at the last meeting. But then he basically know how much carbon dioxide is dissolved in the water. And in some places, there's enough data to be able to know how salinity may change. And then you can actually go back and figure out what you make assumptions about how much carbon dioxide, how much fresh water is added. Then you can recreate those carbonate conditions at some point in the past. And so I don't know how that could be used, but I wonder if there's some, if it fits into any of this criteria development for being able to look at how much has changed, but then couple that with the biological data and the monitoring that is actually proposed for the bond. I don't know where that stands in the current political situation, but where we had the citizen volunteers actually going out and putting out monitoring plates to measure recruitment and correlating that with carbon data. So you're sort of looking at three different things. You're looking at the success of recruitment of barley, which are probably the most sensitive and easiest thing to determine whether they're doing well or they aren't. And coupling that with current carbonate conditions, then also knowing something about the history of those sites, and if you see repeated years where you're not seeing recruitment, and you know that historically that was a good site and it correlates to the data, you can go back and say what it used to be. I don't know, does that help?
So,
that's empirical, that's what we call empirical modeling. We also need the process. So what we didn't do is get at the nitrogen and mineralization rates.
But that approach, I think the idea of trying to recreate historically what's happening now, both in the best place would be is to do a weird biological data. You know that there were consistent plant sets or consistent muscle sets or whatever.
So building on this conversation, I have a question to pose to all of you to kind of reframe what we heard from Mick. So there's a bond that's going up in June of 2017, $45 million. It's not specific to ocean acidification, but there's some reason to think that some of that money might be able to be used for some of the monitoring that was in the original OA specific monitoring bond. But Mick asked us to think, well, what are the legislative initiatives moving forward? You know, starting new year, same makeup as before the study commission. What are the things that we might think about in that frame? And the conversation we've just had, and we've had all day, has highlighted the need for more monitoring, better monitoring, more monitoring equipment. We need to answer some of these fundamental questions about variability, about budgets, about drivers, all of these things, because we don't yet have a handle on them. The reason is that coastal acidification, when you zoom into this scale where it actually matters to organisms, is complex, it's challenging. So my question is, given all that, when do we have enough monitoring, right? Like I come from the science school of thought of we need more, we need to understand these systems better. But at a certain point, to do something about this problem, whether it's adaptation, whether it's phytoremediation, when do we have enough? And should we try to structure the monitoring program that we have in this state to focus really intensively on a few specific areas so that we can really nail down and understand these areas and all their drivers in these particular areas? Or do we try to go up and down the coast and have a better sense of the overall state? We've seen the Gulf of Maine, its potential, telekinetic influences on Saco and Damariscotta. But it strikes me that from Bill's story, from your story, really knowing how this works at a finer scale and investing in that, even though it doesn't allow us to answer these broad questions, gives us some more bang for the buck. Now, that contradicts everything I said in my presentation about we need more monitoring in order to have, brand new water quality criteria. But I don't know, I'm wrestling with this in my mind, and I wanted to share that with this group because I think there are a lot of people in this room who might have some detailed thoughts about what kind of specific monitoring, both for the nutrient criteria question and numeric nutrient criteria question that Ivy posed, and for OA. Nicole.
I have an idea. I worked with the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Institution in the Central Pacific for about a decade, helping them to monitor changes on over 50 in that area. And they were facing the exact same challenges. How to set up a monitoring program at that huge scale, and then how do we attribute any changes we see in those areas, biological changes, to a chemical effect. And the solution that they came up with, I'm not saying it was the solution, but the solution that I worked with many other scientists to come up with was a tiered approach. You do not have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You can have they call segment stations, where you have really intensive monitoring going on, which could be in a Damariscotta River, which hosts a huge amount of aquaculture, or in Casco Bay, where there's a lot of activity. But that doesn't mean you don't have additional places all up and down the coast with kind of a lighter touch monitoring. And then we try to paint this entire picture with limited resources. So that's an idea that they've been implementing for about 5 years now, and it's generating useful information.
I think Nicole's exactly right. In education, we have the same problem at the university. Do you educate students broadly or deeply? And a lot of people like to come up with what they call the T diagram, which is do something broadly and do something deeply. Can't do all of the above.
So here's another question for the group that I'm listening to this conversation, put up a series of policy questions. And we haven't gotten to those policy questions yet, which makes me think, does this group think that there's a significant question first that we need to look at some immediate acts before making a determination of do we get changes in our existing
Speaking of that a little bit, you had a graphic up and it was something with 2 milligrams per liter total nitrogen. You had limits set. And I guess the skeptic in me thinks, how valid is that number? We're now talking about 100th of a milligram per liter. How valid are they, and how biologically appropriate are they? My fear is we don't understand it. We sit around and say, well, 0.32 sounds good to me. We've got some instances with 0.22 is the limit. We'll go ahead and handle things a little differently. And now we're at 0.31, so good. And I wonder about the biological connectivity between the values of given on and what the real world is.
Yeah, I think, well, they're not numeric criteria, and I think if Penelope will allow you, then I should probably, yeah, yes, that was gonna say, I should defer to Penelope.
So those two values, not on the criteria.
Right.
Their guidance and thresholds, but thresholds. Guidance is better, so we use those values if we see exceedances of those values in the environment that we.
And that's what
Because there is a huge amount of variability. Ratio is much more precise than we would see on, so there happens.
So that's one of the differences, I think, too, in numeric criteria, biological, flexibility, and criteria. Although with the numeric criteria that go trying to go for phosphorus, so we try to have some variability built in. So.
Just what I'm taking away briefly is it seems like there isn't enough science to start from a dartboard to set nutrient criteria on these permits. It may not have that big bang for the buck when you spend money to say nutrient removal down to a certain level and spend that $140 million or whatever for one plant. Is there not better things to spend that money on?
That's a really great question, and this look at nutrients is a very precise look. So we know that nutrient pollution has a negative impact on water quality. The question we're asking here is, what type of impact is it having on coastal acidification specifically? So there's good reasons to reduce nitrogen loading to green waters overall.
Right, but is the impact to do it just to a few treatment plants equal to thousands and thousands and thousands of acres runoff running off the coast? And I've heard everybody talking about fertilizers, the impact, agricultural sources, the impact. If you spend $500 million on treatment plants to reduce that nutrient amount just at those discharges, what is the net effect?
It's going to be specific.
Yeah.
I don't think you can say, like, you can't just generalize the answer to that. There have been reports that have estimated that nutrient load, for example, who's happens to know more about Castle Bay than other areas. So there are reports that sort of estimate what percentage of load comes from sewage treatment plants, what percentage of load comes from stormwater runoff. And that's why I put that chart up there. It's a pie chart. My particular talk is focusing specifically on food sources and wasn't meant to sort of single them out. It's just we had a talk on non-food source earlier and bringing it together. So these are all really important decisions, and that's Scott's talk back in June. We talked about that. Like before we spend
I was in worry.
on the other way. Yeah, that's where he was there. Before we spend that, you're right. I mean, it's an overall picture. So, and again, Angie, I invite you. Do you want to add anything to the answer on that question, or add anything else?
You had mentioned that to most effectively establish your treatment criteria, that's a I think that really speaks to the contributions from each of these sources. Those percentages vary on a basis, so you really can't state which is most effective. I mean, yes, there are lower hanging fruit than others in terms of maybe it's easier to reduce that source facility and acres and acres and acres of source. But it really has to be a site-specific.
Example that I think of is, Lake Champlain, the number one source of phosphorus loading there. And that unfortunate water body, the first water log, is compared for phosphorus loading. And the TMPL will require the farmers to reduce their so it really, there are specificities, and that's part of why Castle Bay was identified as a priority, because it's populous, because there is a fair amount of data. There's not
all the data we need, but there's a fair amount of data and it's something that can be worked. I think I saw.
I just had an idea now, it's just getting formulated, but with respect to site specificity and history of what we know at any one of these sites, or what we don't know, part of the monitoring program may include using proxies at those locations to look back in time and figure out what the conditions used to be at those sites. And I'm looking at you because we've got a specialist in the audience who does that.
Yeah, I thought about that, kind of going off of the pH and saturation state for showing and the lack of sort of long-term data. And another question, even if we monitor for 5 or 10 years, there's still some natural cyclicity to the climate that would not necessarily be that proxy data could potentially push it back further in time. But I have done a lot of work with calcifiers and Gulf of Maine, but I know there might be a isolated plan to rise isotopes to pH in the past, and there are a lot of uncertainties in taking that approach as well. But if you're in areas where salinity might be that driver, that would be a much more straightforward I wondered about that as well, but
Before I just want to give all your chance and
I was just going to ask a question. So we know that Castle Bay S3 partnership is embarking on the treatment. I'm wondering if any of the questions that are on the screen now, are these also going to be questions that the work group have? Does anybody, I know that Chris Mullen's not here, but I'm wondering if there's a work group that's already going to start talking about this. If there's overlap.
yeah, really, sorry, I first didn't be here today. I knew, yeah, that you really wanted to be here. Marty's here. And I was just sort of called out with this and we should sit down with Chris and talk about this, because a number of people in this room will be on that nutrient council. Damien, Scott, me, Nancy Altonaro, a lot of people who are really instrumental to reducing pollution loads into Castle Bay. So,
Marty, another initiative of the partnership is to have a monitoring network for Castle Bay, and I'm interested in how those two groups can feed into each other. So I think for the Nutrient Council to keep in mind that if more monitoring is needed, a monitoring network is going to be posing some broader monitoring questions as well as perhaps nutrient-based questions.
Chris?
So a couple of things. We certainly have lots of conservation groups that are involved in monitoring. Some of us are intimately involved with various years, and it might be valuable to leverage what we spend on monitoring in order to properly train people to do more of what we want for collections and user data. Second thing is, as Karen mentioned, proxies, shellfish. We have along the coast of Maine many ancient, some of them prehistoric shell means that are at risk of being lost because of rising sea levels and higher wave action. It might be really valuable to not only meet the archaeological assessment of those, prioritize which ones need to be digs for archaeological reasons, but also to use them for sampling to prehistoric comments what might be useful proxy data.
So just a quick note on that, Alice Kelly at University of Maine has got a project looking at a lot of shellman and sampling, and I'm working with her. Not the question you just laid out, but she'd be in
State, there's work. It's not being exactly done. It's every step.
Sea-Grant.
Okay. From the historic perspective, from the scientific perspective.
So we sort of wrap this up and it goes on to the last section, which will be asking you some questions about what we should be doing as a group. Are there any kind of concluding thoughts? I think I can sum up what I'm hearing is we need more data and maybe we should focus on SDA and we have to put something together. But
So you have the numerical, that's gonna be really hard, you don't know what to sign. Same with the narrative, although we could probably develop it over time. But is there any, does this matrix include like valuation at all, how valuable conservation, recreation, plans that come out there and watch it? Something Sarah.
So let me backtrack a little bit. The context that Aaron and I covered is the Clean Water Act. So the values for the water bodies are set in state law and the water quality standards, and it tells you, SB is what it must be for, SA is the highest standard, SC is sort of the more industrial areas. And so that's going to define those values, and the water body has to meet those values. So regardless of anything else, you can't let a discharge interfere or have the potential to interfere those standards. So it's a little different than science where you guys are looking for, are you really certain? It's like, does it have a reasonable potential?
But wouldn't it be nice to put a valuation on this gentleman said $140 million for a plant? Well, that's not ridiculous, given the $5 million worth of plants that come out of Casco Bay. But if there was an aggregate of $1 billion worth of value or billions of dollars, then it sounds a little smarter if we start talking about.
That's just talking about plans. I'm sorry. Go
Oh, no,
ahead.
I was just going to say, the Clean Water Act context that we're talking about, I think isn't the regulatory vehicle for the kind of ecosystem service valuation and vulnerability assessments that link all of these impacts to our communities that you're talking about. And we need to do that, and we haven't really talked about that. And Sarah's got her hand up, so I think she should come.
And you know what I would say.
Yeah.
So I'm partial. And one thing that it can do for us, I'm so pleased that there's a proposal out to do one in this region. What they can help do is they can help assemble all of the quantitative data, the non-quantitative data, the monetized values and non-monetary values of what we use these regions for and what's biologically important, what's economically important, culturally important. And we can lay all this information together and we can start to figure out where we need more information. So where information can be strategically sought to fill in holes that help decision making. And then we can also identify cases that can be supported. Maybe surprisingly as well. We may find that there may be a socioeconomic reason why a particular community is more vulnerable than another. And what I think is really new is the idea that this vulnerability assessment can be sort of married together with this Clean Water Act regulatory thinking that talks about designated uses and it talks about, so that helps you really evaluate, is a $1 billion investment restoring this particular area going to be matched by benefits? Because I think that's what I was doing about the question that was posed a few minutes ago. The payoff on investing in that. And I think the vulnerability assessment will help provide that bigger picture of that. So,
I just got to poke a little bit because in the terrestrial sense, if we're talking about economic vulnerability, economic census, national parks in this nation are pretty valueless. And I think most of us would argue that many national parks have got an intrinsic value that you cannot measure in economic sense.
I think, yeah, I was just going to say that this conversation is it's not what the Clean Water Act is intended to do. And the Clean Water Act is intended to clean up our water expenditure. And so these studies and all are wonderful and important, but there are so many values that are intrinsic and aren't just about economic benefits that are part of it. I know that our time is up. I think
we can go a little bit.
You want to go a little
Yeah,
longer?
there are a lot of hands.
Are you
Let's
okay
do
with
it.
that? All right, let's do it then. Let's start here. We'll go around. Go ahead.
The trouble with what you're saying with this Clean Water Act is that the average Joe
Governor Maine, or whoever is out there that we have to sell this to, does not care about that numerical value, blah, blah, blah. They want to know if that $1 billion worth of lobster business or something is going to go down the tubes because of this, you know. And we had the only thing we had was the oyster thing, and because of Bill's intelligence, he solved some of that. So it's kind of like not solved it temporarily, but that's the thing. We're going to have to go to this legislative caucus. We're going to have to go to the press. We're going to have to go to all these people, and we still don't know what to tell them. They ask me, "You're the lobster. What's going on out there? What's wrong? What does OA? How does it affect you?" I still sit there saying, "I don't know. I can't. There's nothing I can tell you because every day I go out there and it still looks the same to the naked eye." So we still have to. We're not going to get very far with this unless we still have either the research to find out what's going on ahead of time, the lobsters, and to this thing, and the other thing, or else we're going to have to wait. Do we have some kind of thing like the West Coast with the algal bloom, and suddenly there's a crash, and that whole fishing is going to go down the tubes, and suddenly which we don't want to see.
We don't want to see. Let me give you an answer to that question, to your point, and this is somewhat of a legal answer, which is so based on what you're saying, I'm hearing two different things. The first is that if we want to use the Clean Water Act and stretch it either at a national level or state level to address OA, we have to know a lot more to sell it to whoever it is we want to sell it to. Separate from that, there's a question that operators of the wastewater treatment facilities are raising, which is, it's a lot of money to remove nitrogen from it. So separate than that, we know that nitrogen pollution is a problem. And we know that it adds to OA. We don't have all the data on how it does it, but we know it's a problem creates nuisance algal blooms, it has impacts on eelgrass, reduces dissolved oxygen. We know that it's a problem otherwise. And to address the problem that is how much of it's from stormwater and should be addressed under stormwater permits, how much of it is from point sources and should be addressed that way, there's a tool called integrated planning. And that is a tool that Portland is working with now so that they can look at all their permits together and sort of say, where's the best place to spend the most money so that it isn't put on just the sewage treatment plant, but if they can reduce more of the pollution load and nitrogen loading through stormwater reductions or building conduits or whatever, then the focus would go there. So I think does that make sense that there's sort of two separate pieces?
One of the things that I've seen over these last few years is that the worst thing we did was to separate, so clearly separate OA from all these other, we just mentioned sea level rise, sea level rise. These algal blooms, the warming, all these things have to be holistically looked at and dealt with. But it's very difficult if you're Joel Salisbury and a scientist. You've got to be single pointed and study a very specific single thing. But in order for us to deal with it, we have to deal with it in a broad, holistic way or something. So it's like two different.
Yeah.
It's trying for us. We're trying to go in two different
This is hard stuff. Chris?
Which is even tougher sell on the policy side. But I think the smart approach from a policy perspective is to look at all of those things that are contributing factors and ask, where's the opportunity for win? And that's why in the last legislature I was pushing for farmland restoration, where we're trying to protect the watershed while expanding farming instead of making small investments. It's doing both, but doing it right. And I think we have to look for those opportunities in the policy side and work hard to make it happen from the bottom.
So this broad agreement that we need to get more information. My question is, what can we do to ensure that in this June vote on this bond, that some of these topics are included, funded through that? Is there a plan? Is anybody talking about?
One of the things that we talked about is bringing in small subgroups again, and I think that really perfectly gets up in this next session. Because it may be that we put together that small subgroup that looks at all this and keeps the rest of us all informed, and so that we're totally ready for June and what we want to do. Do you guys want to add anything to that?
No, I think.
Or I'm just going to turn it over.
I think that's a great segue.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. So there's a website address on the screen. This whole system, which is not going to take very long, is only going to work if you pull out a device and plug that address into it. Because what we'll give you are our survey questions, and then as you answer each question, all of you in the room, it'll compile your results immediately. So this is in lieu of harassing you to fill out a Survey Monkey that we send out repeatedly after this, and we get like a 5 to 10% response rate from everyone who goes, because it's one more thing popping up in your email. And our goal in these 10 questions is, and I really hope this works after I'm selling this, our goal in these 10 questions is actually simulate a little bit of discussion exactly about what Ivy just said. You know, what should be the role of MoCA? This is the volunteer partnership that was created in lieu of having an ongoing funded state council. What can we do? Is anyone having problems pulling this up? Does it appear? Okay, great. Okay. So.
Public access, I think, was the one.
All right. Do people need the address again?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or a 12-year-old.
What? Yeah. Right. Now we went back to this, right?
No.
Or it says waiting for polls. Right. So I'm leaving this up here until everyone puts this address in. Then we'll start the poll. And your screens will all change. etc.ch./m2bz. Okay. I'm going to do it. Ready? Okay. Please vote. How would you rate this meeting? So it's anonymous. This is good. Anyone want to be a contrarian? 21 votes. I can wait. Everyone vote? Okay. Thank you. Next question. What do you most often get out of attending MoCA meetings? Networking, staying up to date with main OA happenings, or learning about the science of ocean acidification? It's kind of cool. All right. 22, getting close. This is really helpful. Okay, next question, ready? What is your ideal format for future MoCA meetings? Roundtable discussions, mini symposia style with presentations, or a combination of the two?
We're going to talk about them all, so if there's other in your mind, we can talk about it.
Yeah. Okay, next question. How regularly should MoCA plan future mini symposia style meetings with presentations? So note that's just one of the options rather than the combination. So things like today. That's a resounding vote. All right. Next question. Separately from symposia, what is the best way to share Maine OA-related research, policy, education updates? They had a character limit, so I apologize for the lack of space between education and update. So, no, these are the best ways to reach you. Yeah, short verbal updates, printed updates at meetings, updates posted on the website, a quarterly email update, or an email sent, or an email update sent by email before the meeting. Sorry about that. In other words, you know, we have the updates that were sent in to Susie. We have the presentations, but how should we be sharing updates? Would it be helpful to have some of these other?
Short verbal updates that we call.
No, we used to do it that way, where everyone in the room would have a minute to give their update. We don't do it that way anymore, just because it's taking up a lot of time. There are lots of pros to doing it that way,
But if you like quarterly voicemail messages. Okay, this is pretty clear. Next question. Given MOCA's limited time, what policy topics should we focus on for the next year? We haven't talked about carbon policy. It's recommendation 2 from the commission. Monitoring, OA-related water quality criteria, or nutrients and coastal acidification. Yeah.
well.
No, it's a tough choice. Oh, they was not ranked.
Top one, and realizing kind of we need all of the above.
Yeah, this isn't to say if one gets the vote that nothing else happens or isn't important, but it's to.
It's like great choice. Except it's not.
It's like not having an answer.
It's like, oh, my great choice, thank you. That's it.
Funding for monitoring, design of monitoring programs, all those things. We just talked about that. Okay. Okay. Note taken, modeling. Next question. What is your top priority for MOCA subgroups? So this idea of having potential subgroups where we meet, you know, NECAN has these subgroups. MOCA's talked about having subgroups. How should we be organizing ourselves?
Then we have had subgroups.
Right, we
We
have.
had monitoring subgroups for a while there, we had policy subgroups.
And yes, I understand the contradiction between having the policy topic be monitoring and then having monitoring and policy separate. Okay, so we need all of the subgroups. Okay, great. Next question. Do you see a MOCA monitoring subgroup as playing a key role in coordinating monitoring in the state? And I mean that in sort of coordinating the design of monitoring. Is that a job that MOCA should be doing or talking about doing? We just talked about, you know, Sentinel versus all these different approaches. We know there's all of these groups doing this. Who's going to coordinate the monitoring that's taking place in the state? All right. What might be key actions a monitoring subgroup should take? Coordinate among groups monitoring in Maine, or coordinating with NECAN, or coordinating with EPA? And again, the either or is a bit tough. Okay, 27. Great. Thank you. Oh. In an ideal world, which organization should host and coordinate monitoring data about acidification in Maine? So this is about where the data all gets housed and shared.
As long as you have a 10-minute here.
Yeah.
Can we do this, like, if we all voted in the next 2 days on this and get the results, or is this always, this platform always happen simultaneously?
It's designed for simultaneous. The poll doesn't close, but I control whether it's open or not. And the challenge is you can set it to do one question by question like this, but we can also then set it to have and distribute it to a network with all the questions open and a time limit. So it can go either way. We've organized it this way, but we can just rechange or just tweak the settings.
Yeah. You want to look back through all these and talk about them?
Yeah, we're going to talk about them. So we have till 3:15 and we're almost at the end of the questions, and then we're going to talk about all these openly. And I'll try to, I don't know if I can pull up the graphics like this, but I can pull up the numbers. All right. Would it be beneficial for MoCA to coordinate main focus proposals? This is the last question. To avoid competition with each other.
Oh, you mean collaborative?
Right, just so that everyone knows what's going on from a proposal standpoint.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. I'm gonna hit stop so all your phones will change. So all of those have been saved. Now I gotta just figure out how to put this back up there. But do we want to start having this a conversation about these topics as I do that?
Does anyone have any comments right off the bat before I pull up the questions? Can you go through them again?
Yeah, I'm just curious about what types of monitoring can also fill a role of the experimentation that a lot of the advocates are really looking to push towards. Is there a way to kind of overlap the various groups that want to go in different directions? Are there ways to combine some of those efforts?
That naturally happens. You know, I mean, a lot of us know each other here, and some sort of collaborate with each other based on this. Something like this also helps to open up the opportunity. There are ways.
So the first few questions in that survey were really just to give us feedback on how to make these meetings more effective and useful for people. So most people agreed it was worth the trip. What do you most often get out of attending MoCA meetings? I think that staying up to date with the way happenings are being.
Yep, was 14.
Was the leader, networking is a close second. Are there other things that weren't listed there that you would like to be getting out of MoCA meetings beyond the 3 networking, staying up to date, and learning about OBE? Ideal format for future MoCA meetings.
Combination of the two, got 99 or 96%.
Was someone wanting to put in other that one? Other formats?
Yeah, I was thinking, for this, where there's a lot of information, and not necessarily where we all have to be completely up to date, or not up to, we want to be up to date, we want the concepts, we necessarily need to know all this science behind it. So a lightning talk kind of format might be valuable in the sense along multiple playing
Lightning talks.
What about activities involved in kind of communication, outreach, that kind of stuff? Do people want that? I mean, sometimes, people get like having a chance to talk and stand up and do different kinds of exchanges. But it's also, you know, we're not like, our goal is to share information with each other, not necessarily, you know, it's not a sort of training program. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure, I haven't been to any of the meetings, but there's definitely, I think there's a lot of opportunity to bring in expertise in the communications world, that there's a lot of, in that discussion, that how we talk to our audiences, you know, and what, that was brought forward really for me made a lot of sense, that, and I think looking at like groups like Nokia, it is basically a national initiative for ocean climate change interpretation. And they've got some really awesome concepts that are tried and true and tested, which I think resonated to certain nine. So I would love to bring in some communication type information. Sure.
This one kind of surprised me, how regularly should mini symposia be, just how pronounced the 2 times a year was really clear, the clear winner.
So are folks thinking mini symposia, kind of like what happened today, or symposia that happened in June? That was a longer full day with more talks. Was that seemed like maybe not something we would do twice a year, but were people thinking mini symposia like today, twice a year? So bringing in some external people.
More for updates.
What's that?
More for updates or more for policy?
Yeah, either.
Whatever happens.
Yeah.
I guess I was voting for not more than twice a year, to answer your question.
Okay.
I like the idea of 2 day-ish, doesn't have to be a full day. 2 twice a year, yeah, twice a year, the day is dedicated to this.
Mm-hmm. The next question was about sort of how to share information on all the updates and goings on. Obviously coming together is important, but here quarterly email update was really the big winner.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to read this today. For those of you who did, send me your updates via email. There were 5 of you. I asked for updates that hadn't been reported on, for new stuff, basically, that for those who didn't present today and had new stuff to contribute. We'll post it on the local website. There's some good information in here, but I know there's more out there, so maybe having email sent to me prior to the meeting is the best way to do it. So if we could send out an email to everybody maybe a month before the next meeting, and then send out a quarterly email to everybody, that would give everyone a chance to weigh in and everyone a chance to read it, even if they couldn't. So I like the short verbal updates, but we've gotten too big, which is a great problem to have.
Yeah.
And this wasn't asked, and it's kind of why I was asking my question about this whole question earlier, is what should we be doing to communicate what we're learning and the policy consequences of that to a larger audience? Mm-hmm. So it sounds to me like we discovered a lot about specific needs today in terms of a better model. Certain areas need more data. We've got some very interesting results of research that's been done, all of which I think are worth telling people, and the need for continuing to target some funding to help us answer the questions, to help us continue that value research, and how that relates to our existing industries and the future. All those kind of things are, I think, important so that people start understanding that ocean acidification isn't just a silly acronym.
Mm-hmm.
It's how it's relevant to what we're learning about things important.
I think it's a great segue for not this question, but the next one, which was, given MOCA's limited time, what policy topic, or actually the next one, Aaron, we just skipped the next one.
Yeah.
Which is also, given this limited time, what areas do you think that we should have subgroups in? Because the steering committee can't do all of them. We can't figure out funding, we can't do education. So we need to have subgroups to prioritize. And so, seems like we need a subgroup for all of these topics.
I get in the education outreach area, this is that what NECAN, I mean, that's really a huge tenet of NECAN, and I'm wondering if rather than, because we can't take it all on in response to what Chris is saying, that's an area where we should be looking to NECAN more, using, like that video that you all produced, and that's a wonderful tool. So what are your thoughts with
Yeah, I
respect to
think
that?
that, right now, Esperanza is kind of serving as the umbilical cord between Boca and NECAN. And, I think that's quite effective. I think that, we may, as NECAN matures, we may want to develop some more state-based communication products, instead of having sort of, here's what's going on all around the region, that have a little more targeted approach to that. So I think it is something that could be discussed within the NECAN communication group as to how we want to develop further information.
I am on the NECAN communications committee as well, and I think a lot of their background work, like what the suggestion, looking at who the target audiences are and that sort of thing, can be very beneficial and would definitely be a great overlap. I think for this doing this regional planning at the NECAN level was to provide all the jurisdictions with information that they could use to be effective in communicating with the jurisdictions. So I think that objective is already embedded in the NECAN concept right now.
Part of the Center for Prevention Research mission is to also educate and reach out to non-scientists folks to explain what we're doing. We have two different ways that we're doing this, and I would love to involve more in it. One is to work with the Botanic Garden to start incorporating seaweed, the impacts of seaweed on ecosystem services into their displays that they have, and that can necessarily lead to a discussion about ocean acidification as well. We are also just got confirmation we'll be hosting an information session at the Boston Seafood Expo next March. It would be great to have local representatives there as well. And that will be to a broader international audience into policy and
Ruth?
So I guess I work at a land trust and we're just focused on one section of the post, and it seems like for me to be effective at communicating, I really need to tell the story from the perspective of my local area, making it really local, not my town local. And in some, like, to get a broader sense of how to communicate about education, I think I can help with that, to figure out how to messaging in a way that can reach each local community. I think it's going to take more work with groups that are locally focused on what to make. If we really want to be this.
It's almost as if one thing that crosses all of these, from monitoring to education, outreach, remediation, like we were talking about before, where how to do the monitoring is maybe having some intensive focal areas, intensive local areas where we really focus and build all the dynamics of these stories. It's too big, I think, in some ways to chunk it off at the state level, but there's some places where we have more invested communities, more invested people, more direct impacts, and more data that we might be able to develop these things and do the education outreach work to tell the stories that you want to tell. Yeah.
Which I don't see anybody here from the conservation groups that are part of that social networking yet. That's great, but people to retrieve this information, how to make it relevant to your communities to serve.
Should make sure to pass that on to Larry, who just stepped out. Beth?
In fact, that's all citizen science thing, I think could be any future ways to move it. Think about, what we learn from citizen science, how can we better engage citizen scientists, what are potential ways forward. Which, may
Perhaps building on that, it was interesting to see that there's a very clear yes vote on, do you see a MoCA monitoring subgroup as playing a key role in coordinating monitoring? But then here, in an ideal world, which organizations should host and coordinate the data, NECAN and Maine DEP and NOAA were all up there, but most importantly, MoCA was not. And so that tells me that this group in this room sees MoCA as coordinating the monitoring efforts, but not the data housing and data analysis. And that makes a lot of sense to me, but it's really crisply clear from these polls. And I see a ton of nodding heads, and that's an interesting result for me. Yeah.
Can I say a word about the monitor? I mean, about the data hosting.
Yeah.
Just 20%. So NECAN would be a real good candidate
Yeah.
for this. They would probably want someone
Yeah.
to do that. I agree that I don't think that should be the domain of this group. NOAA, the extremely stringent quality control on depending on the data set, they may not have the capability to take this into NCIC, I think, NECI, they just changed the name of it. But academic and other, what's that NCI? So then I guess the main DEP, that's it, doesn't it?
That's an ideal world.
Yeah. Sorry to jump around like that. In the middle of that was this clear vote that a monitoring subgroup of MoCA should coordinate among the groups monitoring in Maine, and probably also be talking with NECAN, especially if NECAN's hosting the data, but that there's a role in maybe a citizen science workshop or a data monitoring work, I don't know. I mean, there's a clear voice here about that. Sorry, I just took over, Susie.
No, you're running the show here.
I'm just scrolling.
Besides having citizen monitoring, which is, I think, great because it turns into an educational thing right under itself. I was trying to propose earlier that there's other things that groups in New Jersey are doing with the shell, returning the shells and things like that. Is kind of just one thing. You can have an oyster festival, and drink beer, and eat oysters, and find out about this, some group returning shells that they sign on to this thing. And it turns into the best great, the best kind of educational thing you can imagine.
Yeah.
And it's just fun, having a fun out. And then you spin that out into that collecting shells or something.
I just wanted to say something quick because I gotta hit the road soon, but in terms of communicating about the problem of ocean acidification to the public, I think there's two opportunities we have. Me, I'm not from here, I moved here 2 years ago, I am from New England. I find it to be a pioneering state, and really proud to be part of it. We have a lot of firsts that we do here. First seafood industry, first artisanal fishery management strategy with the lobster. There's a lot of firsts that happen here, and we can start to pave the way to be an example for other coastal communities. Two, we know ocean acidification is going to be a problem. We know we haven't measured effects that cannot necessarily attribute changes right now to ocean acidification, but we know it's coming, and we know species are going to react to it. So So we have an opportunity to be proactive rather than reactive to a problem. And that is a really unique opportunity because science supports that possibility. So we need to take advantage of that. I think communicating that might be a bit more inspiring than doing
I think that should be a big part of the message. As one who's always, been dealing with crises, that is my whole thing right now. So I want to be trying to figure this out before it hurts. And I know Richard has been talking about that a lot.
If I can follow that up just a little bit, as a little bit of bias view, I think it's very important that whenever communications occur, policy decisions, et cetera, that the communities directly involved, municipal officials, really be tied into this and have a voice and to really have a lot of discussion surrounding that, because that's going to be one of the primary sources of communications. Is if and when the community says, yeah, you're right, we've got to start doing this, you'll get this. But first thing I got to get this.
But in selling that, that's where, as a business person, I always say this, I think I said it at that symposium before, you make decisions based on the weight of the evidence, not 95% confidence. And I think the weight of the evidence supports what I'm told to say.
And there are solutions that can be applied now at a local level, waiting for carbon policy at a national and international level.
With the coastal program, I've been looking at the Shell project, and this past year, and I started having the conversation. We're taking a model from Chesapeake Bay that has been very, very successful. And that messaging is really an exciting component of it, not only for us saying, yes, we're taking a lead and, you're participating in this, but for the businesses that will be partners in this, will be providing the shells and all. They get to identify, we're doing something for the ocean that's not providing for our business. And it's a real, a very positive, very, I think I'm really cool.
Have you looked into the Billy and Oyster Project?
No.
That is a really good model as well. They have all these restaurants participating in it. And their idea is to restore the oyster reefs all around New York City. God help anybody who eats the oysters. But it's going to attract huge press. And so there's like enormous, it's gone through the Governance Island School. So there's all this educational angle that they're doing really good job.
Thank you. Well, maybe part of what we can do is come up with a set of recommendations, not just for policymakers, but individuals, what they can do to help simplification and assess how much fertilizer they're using on their property. But whenever I give a public talk, I always get the question, well, what can I do? And then kind of stumble back. What can you do? We should come up with a set of suggestions.
Yeah, we have that.
That's a neat way.
Commissioner report.
It is.
Yeah.
We have this
Maybe make it
Rick.
Aaron, yeah, just to put out a word about an opportunity coming up in June that the NECAN MOCA Casco Bay partnership might be interested in being part of. Is the international conference and workshop on lobsters that the University of Maine is hosting in June 4th through 9th of 2017. Climate change, of course, is going to be a big piece of it, and this is sort of the gold standard conference of lobster conferences, if there is such a thing, and that it brings in lobster industries from all over the world. And, hosting it at in Portland on Casco Bay, where lobsters are really the dominant fishery. This makes a lot of sense. So just to put that word out, and if you keep an eye on the website, I can send it to you guys. And
yeah, I have it. it strikes me from our conversation that there's a real appetite for these connections with what we can maybe do now at local or smaller scales, engagement with communities. I mean, those points are so clear from this conversation, and I think really highlight the fact that the set of things what you can do in response to ocean acidification, in addition to monitoring, right, goes beyond some of the policy leverage that we talked about. And those are conversations to have with agencies and everyone. But some of these vulnerability assessments, some of this ability to connect what the effects that we're seeing with how much of a difference is it actually going to make in a community, and are there win-wins and things we know we can do now. There's a lot of support and the flavor of the room right now, if you taste the air, for that. And I think that's really exciting because after last week, we're living in a world where that's the kind of stuff we got to think about if we're actually going to do anything about this. So. Yeah.
We now have identified that there are subgroups and issues people want to work on. How do we next want to do this? We don't leave this meeting without actually having subgroups or some idea for what to do. We're going to be looking at meeting twice annually and having these groups sort of work in the interim.
Can we also look at the question just before that one, Aaron skipped over the policy topics? So, monitoring and nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now can we go back down to the subject?
Yep, monitoring nutrients and not carbon policy or related water quality criteria. Yeah.
So it seems like monitoring is the way we need to go forward for the next, at least for the short term, maybe through June, at least until the fall.
So I just like to reiterate, these data are not going to do us any good unless we work with them.
Yep.
It's not just the science that need to work with them. They need to go into a model, we need to have interpretation and understanding from the public.
Right. I mean,
What if we were to combine policy and remediation and have a subgroup on that too? Because, like I said, it's the application of the data, and my approach is a little more like Bill's, which is with some reasonable potential. It'll be 99% certainty, in the regulatory world. If you're going to have a change, it's really sound good science. But
I agree with that, and I want to add to what Joe said about monitoring is not just, oh, let's do more monitoring, right? It's how do we do monitoring that answers questions, and whose questions, right? There's this idea out there in the sort of academic literature and increasingly in the practical world of decision support tools that use the science that we're producing. And I think that's the direction that some of this needs to go. But which decisions? Citing communities, making a decision at the state level in terms of a permit, that's a really different decision than other coastal planning decisions, which are really different decisions than whether and where to try to pursue phytoremediation, which are really different decisions than do I, clam here, or where do we put new oyster farms? All of those are important decisions. And the data speak to them in different ways, and we need more data for different ones. So I want to, at least in my conceptualization, a monitoring subgroup would not simply be focused on yes, we need more monitoring, but focused on how to best do that monitoring and provide data to make better decisions in the state. See a lot of nods.
So going to Joe's point about you can't just collect the data, you have to have, does having the data available, does that create opportunities for people to use it, to go out and get other grants? And is that what you're saying, Joe?
Well, I mean, that's a benefit of having a database that's pretty accessible. No, that's not really what I'm saying. It is a benefit. No, I think there has to be analysis of that, and maybe what you're saying is this whole facility.
You have to, the first place to start is with data, and from what I know, there's a lot of support that needs to kind of collect the data and then having the data usable and available to make sure it's good.
Right, I mean, kind of like you can take data and you can turn that into action, and you're doing that already, you have all kinds of ideas to do more of that, but I mean, we're talking about getting something to policymakers here, in this room, or somewhere else. We have
And it varies from decision to decision, right? Depending on what context you're trying to use the data, businessman, a policy, a community, it's all different.
The original commission report, but we had talked about, I guess that's what I want to get to, what you do to do that away budget, the proton budget. That's what we're really ultimately after. Well, but that was also part of what was in the commission.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll get to.
So yeah, it's the state of needs.
Teresa, Michelle, Chris, I guess. I don't know why I'm calling people.
I think that was kind of an interesting last point there, but I do think that really identifying what it is to be monitored is key right now. I know I've been in a lot of overtime experiences for monitoring. It's identified as being important, but it's really hard to keep it funded. There's been a lot of monitoring done in the Gulf of Maine, and I'm wondering if there's any overlap. I don't understand the scientific needs, but I would look at what has been done, especially like at the Gulf of Maine scale, and see if there's any way that can feed some of this information that we're looking for. It's really hard to fund monitoring, and so that's just my thought.
So I was wondering if the monitoring group would be charged with or identify questions to be answered in order to strategize and monitoring to answer some of these questions, and then we're still talking about kind of balancing between you Sentinel sites that we get a lot of data from and comparing that to work that's being done that just have PH programs or something. If that could be a way to kind of organize and monitor it so you're not just out there data without questions to be answered.
There is a plan. We all sat down, we created a plan so it could be part of the original model.
Yep.
And so maybe we ought to dust that off and look and see if we still agree with that. Right? And maybe we'll have that.
Yep.
And I guess it also would be coming from Bowdoin's where I feel like we have a lot of students and I have access to resources, data sort of work that places like our Coastal Study Center have, infrastructure and internal funding that can support some of this sort of thing. There are other places like that.
Bill, this makes a point to me. I wonder if we should dust off that plan. Probably, maybe you can start with the group that developed that plan.
I mean, a lot of thought went into that. We all met at the Dawn Center and we actually came up with what are the questions we would ask, how we would do it. There's a plan. So it seems to me the part that I was talking about, it's these costs. And there are costs, so we had a budget.
Yeah, so maybe that's where to start it.
That original plan was developed a year or two.
No, it was
Developed
developed.
in
Yeah.
January.
We continue to work on it.
It was a year.
Yeah, we continued to work on it right up until the time that there were revisions going on in review, up until the time that bond
Fizzle.
yes.
Even in the past year, there's more and more institutions starting their own monitoring. So I think when we dust that off, it would be a great opportunity to reach out to those institutions and find out so you're on.
And this would be a subgroup, so, welcome you on it and everyone who contributed to that original plan and, because I think because it feels like we need to have an action item. We've identified things and we need to go forth from here and do something. So it's not just another symposium.
Second.
So I think starting from that empty is pretty good. I think that we need the research, but it's harder to get the broader data that would let you project and model and then test how research might be applicable to somewhere else in the state besides exactly what data you gathered for the research. If you had more sources of data, the question is, who's going to figure out what our overall overall plan is for the data we want in the state of Maine. It's not going to be funded narrowly by one research project here, another research project here, another here, to give us a picture that we can take results of research and say, okay, based on those findings, these are focus areas that may have problems. Let's do some more work there to quantify this effect.
Well, that's what the plan is.
And that's what we wanted out of our overall plan for data gathering. So I'd say that we have to have the monitoring on a broader design than any particular research, just as much as we need to have that specific research.
The way that we designed this, if I'm recalling, was nomadic.
Yeah.
This was, we would move this into sensitive areas or areas that call for more monitoring.
But there was a starting point where we identified different parts of the state, and we actually talked about the number of police that were gonna go in there, where, how the citizen monitoring groups were gonna interface with all those data. And it was really pretty, it was a good outline, and there was a budget. But I think it should be re-examined.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Nicole's point is really valid.
But
It's a whole
the other part, though, that I think is equally important, maybe this should be the topic of another meeting, is, so we dust that off and we all agree, okay, this is the plan that we want to see happen. How do we get that into that fund? You know, there's no, and maybe this is sort of, you know, a select group of political types talking about this, but I want to know what I can do to try to facilitate having that inclusion in this big line that's going to be voted on in June. And I think that's something somebody ought to be working on that now.
Yeah, so is it that or is it reintroducing that? No, it's not.
I don't think you can reintroduce.
I think there was 5 million in that fund for R&D.
Yeah.
It was thought it was a larger amount for R&D. But 5 million was what the thought was considered as would be going towards this.
The total cost on that monitoring plan was 1.3 million.
For the plan that we come up with, so, you know, out of the, what was it, $55 million? For the whole bond, so we would try to get a little chunk of that, but it's not a very big percentage of the total bond. The total was $55 million from this one in June, and the monitoring program, that's kind of what I remember too.
It was a little low, I think, those figures. I
think the bond we proposed was $3 million.
Yeah.
And I think that the estimates that you all put on, I think when we looked at it from what, you know,
Right.
from our, like how we would budget it internally, we thought you guys were really looking to do this.
On the cheap.
Yeah, so.
Get back from 5.
But I'm wondering, since we're almost out of time,
Yeah,
should we, and also people who want to send out an email asking who wants to be on this group, or how we want to conclude right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great next step. Reinstate the monitoring subgroup. I think that I think it was Bill, you made the point that we need the policy gurus involved in this in
Yep.
order to get it embedded into that bond. And that's kind of what we did last winter, was we had a monitoring group and then we had a policy group led by Ivy
I remember
to
that.
coordinate. And so we can give it another shot.
Try those two groups again, and like combine remediation since it came up so high with the policy group.
Yep.
So maybe somebody here, maybe Chris, you can answer this. How is that decision made? You know, you vote for the bond and a sort of search and this and that. But is there a process after the bond passes, or is it not a priority?
Did you ever look at the language and the bond, and I think it was the MTI. The
Administering the whole thing.
Administering competitive grants.
It is, I believe it's competitive grants. Yeah, I don't know whether it's.
So that's an idea where if MOCA all together put in a grant proposal and we knew what everybody was going to do for pieces of it, we'd have a much higher likelihood.
And if we had the people in place to make sure that that's what was actually going through.
So maybe the course of action is to have a group that was involved and bring more people in, maybe call and whatever else. So to look at the actual plan and update that, and then have another group that comes up with how do we now, what's the strategy for getting that money?
Are there sources of funding to think about outside of that particular bond? Like, I'm thinking if that doesn't work as well enough, or is there a way to scale that down so we can start collecting some like a year's worth of data. And that is outside.
I think this is a really key point, that we want to organize towards getting all of that package into the bond, but it's not as if there isn't monitoring that can be done or aren't other avenues for funding to do this. And so the point is, you have this coordinated plan. It's the plan. We update the plan, we go forward in the bond, but that plan can also be pursued, or elements of it can be pursued outside of the bond if the bond doesn't work, right? It's not as if the plan then is kaput, and it sort of felt like that this last time, where the plan went in to the bond died, and then that was it. So I think it's important for us to think about this as the plan, the monitoring plan that's been put forward, and we're gonna figure out how to do that in whatever way, whether it's through the state or what other way it's involved. I think we're out of time. I don't know.
Wrap it up.
Yeah.
Did anyone want to do the tour?
It's a tour of the State House.
Tour of the State House? Joe? Joe?
Thank you for all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.